Is that really the kind of man you'd mock at dawn when the flag rope clicks in the cold air, and he won't even answer? They scoffed at his faded navy patch, pressed him with cheap laughter, until the dock itself seemed to flinch. Still, when sunlight lifted across the planks, and the quiet thump of his fallen patch echoed back like a heartbeat while something in the harbor shifted toward truth. But quiet men leave echoes too, let me take you back. Morning drifted softly across the New Hampshire dock, brushing pale light over the weathered posts, and the thin curtain of mist still clinging to the water. The gulls were already awake, circling in slow loops, as if they too were doing their rounds. Jack Turner stood near the bow of an old trawler, sleeves rolled up, working a stubborn knot in the mooring line. His jacket, frayed at the cuffs, faded at the shoulders, hung loosely around him, carrying that quiet weight of years lived without fanfare. Two dockhands strolled by, coffee in hand, voices sharp in the cool air. "Look at that faded patch, bet he stitched it on himself. Yeah, real Navy wouldn't wear something like that." Their laughter snapped against the wood like loose rigging. Jack didn't look up. He simply tightened the knot, tested it with a small tug, and moved on to the next line. He carried himself with the kind of calm that made it unclear whether the comments hadn't reached him or had simply lost their ability to cut. A few yards away, Owen lingered behind a stack of lobster traps, pretending to study the tide chart on his phone. 14 slight, curious in that unguarded way kids have before the world teaches them caution. He watched the men walk off, then looked back at Jack, at the patch on his jacket, its once deep navy now sun-bleached almost to gray, the embroidery thread slipping loose on one corner. There was something about the way Jack held himself steady as the post he leaned against that made Owen's attention stick. Most grown men snapped back or muttered under their breath when mocked. Jack only breathed a little deeper, as if letting the moment pass through him like another tide. A sudden voice cut across the dock. "Sir, don't block the lane." Marla Green, Harbor Authority, brisk as always, stood with her clipboard tucked under one arm. Her tone wasn't harsh, just clipped like she'd already decided where he fit on her mental map of the morning. Jack nodded once and shifted aside without a word. Marla moved on heels, clicking. Owen watched Jack sway slightly with the dock as it shifted underfoot, the lines of his face calm, almost resigned. There was a stillness in him that felt older than his 62 years, something carved by weather and time. Jack finished his task and stepped back. A small piece of frayed rope fell from his hand onto the planks. Owen bent to pick it up, turning it between his fingers. It was nothing special, just a scrap, but it felt like part of something he didn't yet understand. He looked up again. Jack was walking toward the far end of the pier, hands tucked into his jacket pockets, shoulders squared against the morning chill. The patch on his sleeve caught a sliver of new sunlight, turning the faded threads into a brief shimmer before he stepped into shadow. Something tugged at Owen's chest, a quiet nudge like a thought forming before it had a name. He watched Jack disappear behind a stack of crates, that ghost blue patch lingering in his mind long after. And for the first time, Owen wondered if the men had been wrong, if the patch wasn't ordinary at all. By late morning, the dock had settled into its usual rhythm engines, humming radios, crackling, the smell of bait drifting over the breeze. Jack Turner walked the narrow lane between two moored boats, checking the lines the way some men checked their watches. He moved quietly, familiar with the tide's moods, content to help where help was needed. Marla Green spotted him the moment she stepped out of the harbor office. Clipboard tucked under her arm, she strode toward him, with the focus of someone convinced a rule was being bent. "Sir," she called out, "you're standing in a restricted dock lane." Jack paused, glanced down at his feet, then stepped aside without protest. Marla scribbled on her form anyway, her pen clicking sharply. She tore off the top slip and held it out to him. "It's just a warning today," she said. "Please be mindful next time." Jack accepted the paper with a slight nod. He tucked it into his jacket pocket, the faded patch brushing against the corner as he did. Marla gave him a brief, assessing look before turning away. A pair of younger fishermen watched from their boat, leaning on the rail. "Probably wants people to think he's Navy," one muttered. "Yeah, nobody wears stuff like that unless they're showing off." Their voices carried easily across the dock. Owen, weaving his bike between stacks of crates, heard them too. He slowed, letting the bike roll alongside him as he glanced toward Jack. The man didn't seem bothered. He was already kneeling beside an older gentleman whose pulley system had jammed. "Let me take a look," Jack murmured. The old man stepped back gratefully. Jack rested one hand on the wooden beam, testing the tension of the line before easing the rope free. A twist, a tug, a small adjustment, simple motions but done with a precision that caught Owen's eye. Sunlight slipped across the patch on Jack's sleeve, revealing a faint thread of gold buried in the frayed stitches. Owen leaned closer, curiosity pulling him forward. He'd seen patches on uniforms in old photos, but this one was stitched differently, older, more deliberate. He didn't know the names of the patterns, but something about the gold thread looked official. Before he could get any closer, Marla's voice cut across the dock again. "Sir, that equipment isn't authorized for public repair," she said, striding back toward them. "Please step away." Jack released the rope immediately and rose, brushing his palms against his jeans. The older man tried to explain, but Marla raised her hand, not unkindly, just firmly. "We have procedures for this," she said. Jack nodded once, calm as ever. Owen watched the exchange, noting how the tension didn't ruffle Jack. It merely passed around him like a wave parting at a rock. More whispers drifted from a nearby boat. "Guy acts like he belongs here. Always fixing something. Always right in the middle of things." Owen frowned, glancing between them and Jack. There was nothing boastful in the way the man moved. If anything, he seemed to shrink from attention. Yet the gossip threaded through the air, like loose fishing lines snagging, tangling, pulling people into assumptions. Jack walked away quietly, heading toward the end of the dock. The sun slid behind a cloud, and for a brief second, the faded navy patch brightened under the softened light, the gold thread catching like a small spark. Across the pier, Marla checked her schedule, tapping her pen against the clipboard. "Inspections tomorrow," she said, to no one in particular. "Hope no one causes trouble." The harbor diner opened with the soft clatter of dishes and the faint glow of neon catching in the window glass. Owen slid into a booth across from Jack, who was already stirring a small packet of sugar into his coffee. The waitress topped off both cups without asking, leaving behind the familiar scent of roasted beans and warm toast. "Thanks," Jack said quietly. Owen nudged his plate of pancakes a little closer to the center. "You come here every morning?" "Most," Jack replied. "Helps me keep an eye on the tide before things get busy." Owen waited for him to say more, and eventually Jack did stories about storms that rolled in too fast, about fog so thick you could lose sight of your own hands, about currents that carved paths in the water like living things. He spoke gently, shaping each memory with the calm precision of someone who'd lived through enough to know what mattered. But whenever a detail drifted close to Navy life, he softened the edges or stepped around it entirely, letting the moment drift like a buoy set loose on the tide. The diner door swung open, and a few regulars shuffled in, nodding toward Owen before glancing at Jack with the same quiet curiosity the dock workers had shown. Not hostile, just uncertain. People in small towns liked to know who fit where, and Jack, with his faded patch and steady presence, didn't fit easily anywhere. After breakfast, they walked back toward the dock. The sun had climbed, laying broad beams of light across the water. A stray buoy knocked against a piling, its rope twisted wrong. Jack stepped toward it, without thinking, testing the line with practiced fingers. "Hold on," he murmured. "This'll take a second." He crouched, working the knot loose, adjusting the tension, moving with the kind of instinctive ease that made Owen think of long watches and quiet decks. A few townsfolk stood nearby, whispering behind raised hands. "That guy again," one murmured. "Acts like he owns the place." Owen bristled, but Jack didn't react. He stood brushing off his palms, eyes fixed on the horizon, as if measuring the distance between waves. The boy followed his gaze and saw the way Jack's posture shifted, small, almost imperceptible, like a man listening for something only he could hear. Marla's voice cut through the moment. "Don't act like your crew here," she said, pacing toward them. "If something needs fixing, you call it in. Understood?" Jack nodded once. "Yes, ma'am." Her tone wasn't cruel, but it carried that administrative weight that made Owen's stomach twist. Jack accepted it without resistance, stepping back as Marla moved on with her clipboard tucked against her side. Behind them, another fisherman's voice drifted over the planks. "Phony Navy man." Jack paused, just for a breath. His eyes moved toward the open water, and something in his expression tightened. Not anger, not hurt, just a quiet kind of remembering. The breeze lifted the edge of his jacket, revealing a deeper glimpse of the worn patch, the faint glint of gold thread still holding on. Owen walked beside him as they made their way down the pier, the boards creaking softly underfoot. Boats rocked in their slips ropes, knocking rhythmically against cleats as afternoon inched closer. And even though nothing obvious had changed, Owen felt it, the air shifting, a subtle tension, gathering like the pressure before a storm. "Tomorrow," he murmured almost to himself, "the dock's gonna be busier than ever. And something's gonna happen." The day of the harbor inspection arrived with a restless wind sweeping across the water, carrying the scent of salt and engine oil. Flags snapped sharply along the pier, their ropes humming like taut strings. Town officials clustered near the platform, set up for the ceremony, checking clipboards and radioing last-minute adjustments. The dock had never looked so crowded. Owen lingered near the back, searching for Jack among the faces. He spotted him standing off to one side, hands in his jacket pockets, gaze steady on the horizon. The faded patch on his sleeve caught a flicker of sunlight, and then dimmed again as a cloud rolled by. A sharp gust hit the dock. The ceremonial mast, decorated with ribbons, and a freshly polished emblem swayed more than it should have. The mooring lines attached to its base trembled under the strain. One of the crew shouted toward Marla, "We need to tighten the lead line, winds picking up." Before anyone could move, a loud crack split the air. The main rope snapped, whipping sideways as the mast lurched, tilting at a dangerous angle above the officials gathered below. Papers flew. Someone yelled. Marla spun around. "Stop everything," she cried. People scattered, searching for instructions, for leadership, for someone who knew what to do. Jack stepped forward. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't fast. It was simply certain, like someone responding to a call he'd heard 1,000 times before. As he moved, the full weight of the ceremony's rules and expectations seemed to press down on him, a rigid protocol slamming into place. It wasn't physical force, it was the invisible demand of order duty and the eyes of a crowd waiting for someone to take charge. He reached the mast, bracing himself under its leaning structure, gripping the horizontal beam with both hands. His boots steadied against the planks as he shifted the weight just enough to keep it from crashing onto the platform. "Get the secondary lines," he called out, voice firm but calm. The deckhands froze for half a heartbeat. No one had ever heard Jack sound like that. Then they scrambled into motion, grabbing ropes, knotting new leads, following his clipped, confident instructions. "Secure the left flank. tighten that no 2 more inches good. Owen watched, breath held tight in his chest. Jack wasn't guessing. He wasn't lucky. He was leading precise, steady, the way someone trained long ago would step instinctively into a moment meant for them. The crowd fell into a stunned hush. As the mast steadied, Jack shifted his grip. Something slipped from his sleeve, a soft thump on the dock. His patch had come loose, landing on the warm wooden planks. Sunlight caught its worn threads, igniting the faded navy, and the faint gold stitching, like an ember brought back to life. A ripple passed through the crowd as a distinguished figure approached from the harbor steps. The uniform, the bearing, the quiet authority, it could only be one person. The Admiral. He moved toward Jack with a slow, deliberate stride, stopping only when he stood close enough that Jack could feel the gravity of his presence, heavy as memory. The Admiral's gaze lowered to the patch on the dock, then rose to meet Jack's eyes. He leaned in, voice low, steady, carrying a truth the wind itself seemed to pause for. "That's no ordinary patch." The dock went silent. Even the gulls seemed to hover mid-cry. Owen felt something shift, not just in Jack, but in everyone who had judged him, doubted him, dismissed him. And in that second, the whole dock finally understood. By the time the crowd gathered in the harbor office meeting room that evening, the sun had already dropped behind the line of pines above the shoreline. Lamps glowed warmly along the walls, casting long reflections across the polished table at the center. People spoke in low voices, the kind that carried both apology and uncertainty. Word of what happened during the inspection had spread quickly, faster than any announcement Marla could have issued. Jack stood near the back, hands folded loosely in front of him. He looked like a man waiting for a bus 2 minutes late. Not uncomfortable, just patient in a way most people didn't know how to be. Owen stayed close, the patch held carefully in both hands, its frayed edges catching the dim light. When Marla stepped forward, the room fell quiet. She looked at Jack with the expression of someone sorting through thoughts too long delayed. "Jack," she said, voice steady but softening. "I was wrong." A few murmurs ran through the room, but Marla kept her eyes on him. "I misjudged your presence out there. I thought you were interfering when all along you were helping, and today you kept people safe when everything could have gone very differently." Jack dipped his head. Anyone would have stepped in. "No," Marla said a little more firmly. "Not anyone." 2 dock workers came forward next, caps in hand. They shifted awkwardly before one of them spoke. "Sir, we owe you an apology. We shouldn't have said what we said. About the patch, and everything else." "Yeah," the second added. "We got it wrong." Their sincerity spread through the room like the tide lifting all moored boats. People began to share stories, small ones, quiet ones that suddenly seemed much bigger in hindsight. A woman lifted her hand. "Last winter, when the ramp iced over, I remember Jack helping Mr. Dalton tie down his skiff so it wouldn't drift. Nobody asked him. He just did it." A lighthouse keeper cleared his throat. "2 summers ago, our pump jammed. Thought we'd have to haul parts from Portland, but Jack fixed it in 20 minutes. A father, standing near the doorway, added, "My boy almost wandered into the cross-current channel last year. Jack was the one who stopped him." Owen looked up at Jack, seeing the man through a wider lens, now quiet service not marked by announcements or uniforms, but by small, steady acts that held the community together. He stepped forward and gently placed the patch in the center of the table. The room stilled as every eye settled on it. "He didn't need anyone to know," Owen said softly. "But we should have seen it." Jack opened his mouth slightly as if searching for words, but closed it again. There was nothing to add. The patch said enough. Marla cleared her throat. "Tomorrow," she told the room, "we're planning something for Jack. Something he won't be expecting. So keep it quiet for now." A low, warm ripple passed through the gathered neighbors' agreement, gratitude, and maybe a little excitement. Jack looked around the room, confused by the sudden hush and sideways smiles. Owen caught his eye and offered a small grin. But he didn't explain. Whatever tomorrow held, it belonged to the town now. Late afternoon drifted gently over the harbor, painting the windows of the harbor office in a warm, amber glow. The tide had settled into its slow evening rhythm, and the sounds of the dock softened boats, rocking gulls, quieting ropes, tapping lazily against cleats. Inside the office, a small group gathered near the front wall, where a new frame had been hung, its brass edges catching the last hints of daylight. At the center of the frame sat Jack Turner's faded navy patch. It rested behind a clean sheet of glass, the worn threads preserved just as they were, the frayed corner still lifting slightly, as if stirred by memory. Beneath it, etched on a simple brass plate, were the words, "For quiet service no one saw." Owen stood closest to the frame, smoothing down the edge of a folded piece of paper he'd carried in his pocket all day. He glanced back at Jack, who lingered near the doorway, unsure whether he should come any closer. The crowd parted for him anyway. People stepped aside with a gentleness that felt new, almost reverent. Jack finally approached his boots, slow against the old wooden floor. His gaze rose to the patch, and something in his expression softened. He lifted one hand and placed it lightly against the glass fingertips, brushing the cool surface. For a moment, the room felt suspended, like the whole harbor was holding its breath. Owen unfolded the paper and slipped it into the small slot below the frame. The note rested there like it belonged, the handwriting uneven but earnest. "Thank you for standing watch when no one watched." Jack blinked, the words settling into him like a tide that had been trying to reach shore for years. His jaw tightened, not in resistance but in quiet emotion held carefully in place. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Outside the window, the sun dipped lower, turning the water to molten gold. The reflection glinted against the glass, lighting the patch, with a glow that made every faded stitch feel alive again. A few people murmured their thanks as they passed Jack on their way out, soft nods, brief pats on the shoulder, a recognition long overdue. Owen remained beside him. "Mr. Turner," he asked, voice just above a whisper. Jack turned his head slightly. It wasn't an ordinary patch. Was it? For a long second, Jack didn't answer. He kept his gaze on the framed insignia, on the stories locked inside its threads, on the friends he'd served with, and the days that had worn the colors down. Then he looked at Owen, the corner of his mouth lifting into a gentle, knowing smile. "Guess not, kid." The boy smiled back, relief and pride settling across his face. Outside, the dock caught the last bright sweep of sunset, turning the water into a soft, glowing path stretching toward the horizon. The office lights flickered on one by one, warming the room as the sky dimmed. Jack stayed a little longer, hands still near the glass, standing the same way he always had, steady, unassuming, as though keeping watch even when the world thought no watch was needed. And as the evening settled in around him, the quiet truth of the moment lingered, asking nothing more than to be remembered. If this story moved, you share it forward. Evening settled softly over the harbor as Jack stood before the framed patch, the glass catching the last streaks of gold drifting across the water, and the quiet room behind him held the same kind of respect usually saved for old hymns. People had gone home, but their gratitude lingered like a warm lantern in a winter window, small, steady, and bright enough to guide anyone who needed it. Still, it was the handwritten note beneath the patch that stayed with him most. "Thank you for standing watch when no one watched." He touched the frame lightly, remembering the years that had shaped those threads. Then he stepped back as Owen's voice rose behind him, gentle as dusk. "It wasn't an ordinary patch, was it?" Mr. Turner Jack's smile grew humble and earned. Guess not, kid.